Harlem in 1935 was a neighborhood living two different lives at the same time. By day, it was unmistakably black. Black businesses lining the streets, black families packed into apartments, black workers hustling through the worst years of the Great Depression. Money was scarce, jobs were fragile, and dignity was often the only thing people truly owned. Yet even in hardship, Harlem pulsed with creativity, ambition, and pride. This was a community building something beautiful under constant pressure. A place where survival and culture walked hand in hand. But when the sun went down, Harlem transformed. Harlem in the 1930s was black by day and white by night. As evening fell, cars from downtown Manhattan rolled north packed with wealthy white tourists searching for excitement. They came for the music, for the thrill of danger without consequence, for the feeling of slumming it while knowing they could leave whenever they wanted. They flooded into nightclubs, cabarets, and theaters, treating Harlem like an exotic playground rather than a living community. What drew them was black culture, black music, black performers whose talent reshaped American entertainment forever. Jazz spilled out of club doors, trumpet notes bouncing off brick walls, drums echoing through the streets. Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, and countless others created sounds that defined an era. Yet the people creating this culture were rarely allowed to enjoy it the same way. They performed on stage, cooked in kitchens, served drinks, cleaned floors, and then exited through back doors into the same poverty they'd briefly helped others escape. White America loved black music, as long as black people stayed off the guest list. That contradiction sat at the heart of Harlem's nightlife. The most profitable clubs in the neighborhood were owned by white businessmen. The money flowed out of Harlem as quickly as it came in. Black labor powered the industry. Black creativity sold the experience, but black patrons were treated as intruders in their own neighborhood. Segregation wasn't accidental. It was built into the business model. No place symbolized that hypocrisy more clearly than the Cotton Club, located in the middle of Harlem, branded entirely around black culture and dependent on black talent. It refused black customers without exception. White patrons sat comfortably in plush seats, sipping drinks while watching black performers sing and dance just feet away. Harlem provided everything the club needed except permission for its own people to enter through the front door. And for years, that insult went unchallenged, until one September evening in 1935, when the wrong man was told he didn't belong. By 1935, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was not an unknown man wandering Harlem's streets. He was already a legend in the neighborhood, spoken about carefully and with respect. Johnson controlled powerful policy operations, the underground lottery that quietly kept Harlem's economy moving when legitimate opportunities were closed off. His organization paid rent, fed families, and employed hundreds in a time when the Depression had stripped black communities of almost every safety net. People might not have approved of how the money was made, but they understood who made sure it circulated. Johnson's reputation wasn't built on chaos or reckless violence. It was built on discipline, intelligence, and control. He read philosophy and poetry, quoted Shakespeare, and believed that power without order was weakness. Unlike many gangsters of his era, Bumpy valued patience over impulse. He understood systems, not just streets. And more than money, more than territory, he cared deeply about dignity. Public disrespect, especially racial humiliation, was something he never forgot and never dismissed. How Johnson presented himself mattered. He dressed deliberately, not to impress white society, but to assert his own worth. Tailored suits, polished shoes, crisp shirts, and careful grooming were armor. In a world designed to reduce black men to servants or criminals, Bumpy Johnson refused to look like either. Clothing was his way of saying he belonged anywhere his feet touched. Respectability wasn't assimilation to him. It was defiance. That night, Johnson didn't approach the Cotton Club as a beggar or a thrill-seeker. He wasn't trying to sneak in through a side door or test the rules for fun. Bumpy Johnson wasn't trying to sneak in. He was invited. A legitimate businessman had requested the meeting. A private conversation in a place known for discretion. In Johnson's mind, this wasn't about nightlife or entertainment. It was business. And because it was business, Johnson expected to be treated as an equal, not because he was naive about racism, but because he understood power. He knew who he was. He knew the influence he held. He knew how much of Harlem's economy flowed through his hands. Being turned away wasn't just a personal insult. It was a public declaration that no amount of money, intelligence, or authority could override the color line. That moment at the door cut deeper than anger. It exposed a truth Johnson already understood but had never felt so directly. In white-controlled spaces, black success didn't matter. Black excellence didn't matter. Black power was tolerated only when it stayed invisible. And standing there in that tailored suit, Bumpy Johnson realized this wasn't just about him. It was about every black man who had done everything right and was still told he didn't belong. The entrance to the Cotton Club looked ordinary to the people passing by. A doorway, a line of waiting patrons, a uniformed doorman deciding who stepped inside and who didn't. That doorman was named Thomas Murphy, a broad-shouldered white man whose authority came not from intelligence or accomplishment, but from the rules of the place he guarded. His job was simple: keep Harlem out of its own club. When Bumpy Johnson approached, Murphy didn't hesitate. He stepped directly into his path, blocking the entrance with practiced confidence. He didn't ask for a ticket, didn't check a name. He looked at Johnson's face and saw only color. His voice was loud enough to carry across the sidewalk, loud enough for everyone waiting in line to hear. He called him boy, told him the club was for white patrons only, said they didn't serve coloreds except as entertainers or staff. Then came the final order: move along, or the police would be called. The words landed exactly as they were intended to, not just to reject, but to humiliate. To remind Johnson of his place in front of an audience, and that audience mattered. Behind Johnson stood a line of white patrons dressed for an evening of excitement. Some smirked, some looked uncomfortable, some approved silently. None spoke up. They watched, curious to see whether this well-dressed black man would make a scene or accept his dismissal the way they believed he should. Johnson felt every pair of eyes on his back. He could hear murmured comments, quiet laughter, and the familiar tone of contempt that had followed black men into white spaces for generations. This wasn't just one doorman's cruelty. It was performance. A public ritual meant to reassure white patrons that the boundaries were still intact, that Harlem at night might belong to them, but only on their terms. And in that moment, Johnson understood something clearly. The insult wasn't personal. It was structural. Murphy didn't need to know who Johnson was. He didn't need to recognize power or wealth or reputation. The system didn't require recognition. It required obedience. The Cotton Club's policy was designed so that no black man, no matter how successful, could cross that threshold as a customer. The insult was built into the door itself. Everything in Johnson's body demanded a response. Anger tightened his chest. His hands clenched at his sides. He knew exactly how easily this could turn violent. One word spoken too loudly, one step forward, and the night would end in police batons, headlines, and a narrative that painted him as the problem, a dangerous Negro who didn't know his place. So Johnson did something that took more strength than striking back. He stopped. He looked Murphy in the eyes, not with fear, not with pleading, but with a calm that unsettled him. For 3 long seconds, the noise of the street faded. Murphy's confidence flickered. He sensed, without understanding why, that this moment wasn't ending the way he expected. Then Bumpy Johnson smiled, not warmly, not kindly. It was a controlled expression, measured and deliberate, the kind of smile that said this wasn't over, that memory was being made. He nodded once, turned away from the door, and walked back down West 142nd Street, his back straight, his pace unhurried, leaving behind a sidewalk full of people who thought they had just witnessed another black man being put in his place. Unaware they had just watched the beginning of something far larger. Bumpy Johnson's decision to walk away from the Cotton Club door wasn't hesitation, and it wasn't fear. It was calculation. He understood the rules of that sidewalk better than anyone watching him. Arguing with the doorman would have changed nothing. Murphy didn't have the authority to bend the rules even if he wanted to. The policy was absolute, and any debate would only entertain the crowd and invite the police. Words, in that moment, were powerless. Fighting would have been worse. One swing of a fist would have erased everything Johnson had built. A black man striking a white doorman outside a whites-only club in 1935 wasn't self-defense. It was an excuse for violence, for arrests, for newspapers to run familiar headlines about disorder in Harlem. Johnson knew how quickly the narrative would turn. He wouldn't be the businessman insulted at the door. He'd be the dangerous Negro who proved why segregation was necessary. Violence also would have cost him something more valuable than freedom: control. Bumpy Johnson survived and thrived because he chose when conflict happened. Losing that control in a public moment would have handed power to everyone else: the police, the club owners, the politicians who tolerated the Cotton Club's racism because it made money. Acting on anger would have served their interests, not his. As he walked away, Johnson replayed the scene in his mind. The words, the faces, the structure that allowed a doorman to speak with absolute certainty. He wasn't thinking about revenge. He was thinking about leverage, about who benefited from the Cotton Club and who paid the price, about how deeply the club depended on Harlem while openly disrespecting it. The insult was fresh, but it was already being reshaped into strategy. Johnson knew something most men didn't. Immediate retaliation feels powerful, but it rarely changes anything. Real power shifts happen quietly, behind the scenes, long before anyone realizes a battle has begun. He understood that if he reacted emotionally, the moment would end right there on the sidewalk. If he reacted strategically, the moment could grow. Walking away wasn't surrender. It was preparation. Preparation to respond on his own terms. Preparation to move the fight from the doorway, where he had no power, to the system itself, where the Cotton Club was vulnerable. As Johnson disappeared into Harlem's streets, the crowd behind him relaxed, satisfied that order had been maintained. They didn't know they'd just witnessed the calm before a carefully planned storm. Johnson walked without direction at first, letting the night air cool the anger that still burned beneath his calm. Harlem stretched around him, alive despite the depression, lit by street lamps and storefronts that never truly slept. After nearly 15 minutes, he found himself standing outside the Savoy Ballroom on Lenox Avenue. The contrast was immediate and unmistakable. The Savoy was different. Black-owned, black-operated, black patrons entering through the front door without hesitation or permission. Couples laughed as they stepped inside, workers still in their uniforms, professionals in pressed suits, families dressed for a night out. No one guarded the entrance to remind them where they belonged. This was a space built for the community that lived here, not tourists looking for a thrill. Johnson stood there watching the flow of people and felt the weight of comparison settle in. Just blocks away, the Cotton Club sat on Harlem soil, fed by Harlem talent, staffed by Harlem labor, yet closed its doors to Harlem's people. One space circulated money inside the community. The other extracted it. One strengthened Harlem. The other drained it while pretending to celebrate it.